Welcome to camp with Dr. Mawson. On behalf of all the students and staff sitting here, I would like to thank you for your time today. Dr. Mawson was educated at St. Peter's College and the Queen's College at Oxford. He held a number of temporary lectureships at other colleges before returning to St. Peter's in 1998, where he is now one of the 2 philosophy fellows. He researches in philosophy of religion, philosophical theology, and value theory. His talk today will be on probability of God.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, let's say a few words about that then, and hopefully they'll be sufficient to generate some interest, some questions, some disagreements perhaps. So let me start with the concept of God. So as perhaps you all know already, I don't know what your backgrounds are or what your exposure to philosophy has been to date, but as you perhaps know already, the sort of God that's mainly reflected on by those working in the philosophy of religion is the God of theism. And it's generally supposed that this is the sort of God that Jews, Christians, Muslims, and at least some Hindus believe in. It's the case that Jews, Christians, Muslims disagree about various things about God, as well as things about this world, of course, as any skim of a newspaper will tell you. But it's also generally thought that they probably agree fundamentally on one of the most important bits of metaphysics, the most important bit to which the human mind may ever direct itself, the idea that it was a God understood as an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good creator of everything other than himself. And it's him who they intend to worship in their various ways. And the only safe generalization about Hinduism is that there are no safe generalizations about Hinduism, but at least some forms of Hinduism seem to believe that Vishnu has those properties too. And so in that sense, those versions of Hinduism at least are theistic gods. They're not monotheistic gods, as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are, but they're theistic in their understanding of Vishnu. So that's the sort of God, the existence of which, arguments for and against the existence of which philosophers of religion tend to concern themselves with. And in concerning themselves with that, then, arguably, they're concerning themselves with this common feature of at least 3, possibly 4 of the world's major religions, and what prospects there are for defending or attacking that central claim of those religions. I think it would also be fair to say, then turning a little bit to the probability aspect of things, it would also be fair to say that since Joseph Butler, but most recently since some contemporary, he's died now, Basil Mitchell, philosophers, and then more recently Richard Swinburne, who is still alive in his 80s now. The idea has been that we should think about some of the traditional arguments for and against the existence of God, primarily in terms of probability. So it's no longer generally thought that one does best either pro-God or anti-God to present an argument supposing, as one does so, that it deductively proves that there must be a God, or conversely, that there must not be a God. Some still think that's a good project to engage in, and so there are there's a minority pursuing that type of activity. But most think, no, we can't really prove one way or the other definitively with 100% certainty that there is a God, or indeed with 100% certainty that there's not a God if they're on that side. But what we can do is raise some considerations which raise the probability of there being a God, or conversely on the other side, decrease the probability of there being a God. And so we're really in the realm of judging what the evidence makes probable rather than what the evidence makes certain when we judge either for or against the existence of God on the basis of these arguments as they're now generally considered. So probability is not an immediately clear notion, but I think we all have some intuitive understanding of it. And of course, you can make that understanding more precise and think about more complex problems if you study maths. And we'll all be familiar with ideas, I suppose, depending on when we gave up maths, we'll be more or less familiar with them, but familiar ideas of such as, oh, okay, if I give you a big bag and it's got, I say, look, it's as big, this bag has got exactly 1,000 marbles in it, and a certain proportion of them are black and a certain proportion of them are white, and there's none that are not either black or white. And the proportions are very simple. I've either put 25%, i.e. 250 black ones in, or 25% and the rest are white, or 25% white ones and the rest are black, or 50-50, half are black and half are white. And what do you think? You say, well, I don't know what I think yet about what's actually in the bag. Let me draw out a few marbles. So then you draw out a marble and it's white. And you think, well, that doesn't really do much evidentially to support any hypothesis of the ones that he's told me I need to choose between. You draw out another one and that's white. Okay, then, well, that could equally well be true pretty much on any of these things. But after a certain number of marbles drawing out, you might start to think you've accumulated pretty good evidence. Of course, in the extreme case, once you've drawn out all 1,000, you've drawn all the evidence that can be, and it's conclusive. And indeed, it will be conclusive before then, if you take me at my word that the proportions are going to be one of those that I've said they're going to be. But after you've drawn out, let's say, 100 marbles, and you found that 76 of them have been black and 24 of them have been white, well, that's pretty good evidence that the proportion is the 25% white and 75% black then, isn't it? So you can gain evidence that doesn't make your conclusion that, no, it's probably this proportion. Sorry, it doesn't make your conclusion it's this proportion rather than that necessarily true. You might be wrong, but as you gain more and more evidence, you get more and more rational justification. Now, in the case of that thought experiment, the probabilities can be mathematicized relatively easily and precisely. In the case of more day-to-day situations, that's seldom the case. But the similar logic will apply. You're on a jury. The defendant, let's make it serious, defendant is up there for charged with murder, and the prosecution is presenting various bits of evidence. And one of these bits of evidence is that the defendant has a violent temper and has already been known to have beaten nearly to death several other people. And the victim of this crime was beaten to death. So you think, well, okay, that is some evidence that is cogent. I mean, that's not a total irrelevance to the thing. How much does this raise the probability of the defendant having actually done this murder? Not sure. What else has the prosecution got? Oh, well, the defendant was seen leaving the scene of the crime, moments after the thing. Okay, but still, that's hardly conclusive. How many other people were seen leaving the scene of the crime, and so on and so forth? But you can imagine an accumulation of factors of this sort might in the end lead you as a jury member to think, well, I'm not absolutely certain, I can't be absolutely certain that he's guilty, but I think I've heard enough now to think that it's more likely than not that he's guilty. So if it was a civil case, that would be sufficient. You've just got to judge on the balance of probabilities. If it was a criminal case, as this one presumably will be, although it depends a bit on the context, you've got to judge beyond reasonable doubt. But either way, the evidence might edge things up such that you could turn in good conscience a verdict that, you know what, I'm going to vote this way rather than that on the issue. And that is how people who think about God and probability tend to think about the arguments that are functioning for and against God's existence. And we could consider some of those arguments if you like, or we could consider some of these methodological issues further later. But just one final thing before I shut up and let you ask whatever questions you want to ask. You might think, and some people think, well, this is a bit strange, isn't it? What implications is this going to have for religious life? Suppose that one were to conduct this series of investigations into all the arguments, ideally, all the arguments that have ever been presented for the existence of God, or all the arguments that have ever been presented against the existence of God. I mean, that would be a task beyond a finite lifetime such as ours to accomplish. But suppose you go for that and you do it. In the end, you might end up finding out that it's 64% likely that God exists. What good is that to you? How are you going to lead a religious life based on a probability? I think it was Joseph Butler, who I mentioned earlier, who said, probability is the very guide of life. It might have been John Henry Cardinal Newman, not quite sure. Maybe Newman said it after Butler. Often in everyday life, we do have to make decisions based on probability. Indeed, I think if I asked you, if you're with your philosophical skeptic's hat on, do you know with absolute certainty anything about the world you take yourself to be navigating around, that you really absolutely, you weren't created 5 seconds ago with a load of false memories of a life that you've never led? Do you really know that with 100% certainty? So on and so forth. You might say, okay, I suppose technically I don't know anything other than with a certain degree of probability. So I can't let the fact that this sort of method would only ever raise the probability of God's existence to a certain extent, never render it 100% certain. I can't take that really as a sufficient reason to think that it can have no action guiding implications for my life. And there's a good thought experiment in this context, because you might, which Richard Swinburne presents in one of his books, which I'll leave you with before I let you have some questions. Because you might think, well, it's not actually probably going to edge it up above 64%, is it? It's going to maybe leave it languishing below even 50%, or at least it is when I start inflecting it with the peculiarities of those world's religions, which you rather glossed over earlier. Suppose I end up deciding that, yeah, okay, maybe it's even more likely than not that God exists. Well, okay, but which of the three major monotheistic religions am I going to believe in now, or a polytheistic religion? Maybe that should be preferred. He has this thought experiment. He says, because you might think, well, okay, maybe I'll narrow it down. It's one of the monotheistic religions, so they each gets 33% probability, 33.3%. Okay, so which of these am I going to pick on this basis? Well, he suggests, well, suppose you look into one and one edges up to sort of 34% and the others stay at 33, as it were, because I had a little percentage left over by dividing 100 into 333s. Suppose you end up like that. Okay, so you've got 34% likelihood of this and a 33 and 33. What is it reasonable for you to do? And this is his little thought experimental analogy. He says, suppose you found yourself in a cave, and you wake up in this cave and you find this note attached to yourself. And the note says, look, there are three passages leading up out of this cave. And you look around, and indeed there are. And you've got a very dim light here, but you can see there are three passages. You've got a little torch there that shows you that those three passages. And the note says, well, yeah, two of these passages don't lead to the surface. But the other one does. One of them does. And, by the time you went up the wrong passage, if you choose the wrong passage, well, it'll be too late to turn back and find the right passage. Good luck. So you think, oh, this isn't the most cheering note I've ever been left. But anyway, you think about it a bit, and you sort of look at the passages as best you can, and you detect in the end maybe there's a slight gust of wind coming down one, maybe there's a slight, you turn your torch off and see if you can do it, and maybe there's a slight glimmer of light from one, maybe there isn't. Okay, so in the end you decide, you know what, I think it's 34% likely that it's this passage and 33% likely that it's this, 33% likely that it's this. What is it then rational for you to do? And he says, well, it's certainly not rational for you just to sort of sit tight, and because you can't achieve greater certainty than that, not go up any of the passages. The thing to do is to pick the least unlikely passage and commit yourself to that. Commit yourself to it wholeheartedly. Perhaps the note said, unless you really struggle up even the right passage, you'll never get to the surface. The right passage is only going to lead to the surface if you commit yourself to it wholeheartedly. If you go up it always wondering whether you've chosen the wrong one, well, you'll probably not motivate yourself to go up it sufficiently fast to get to the surface before your air runs out, something like that. If you're in that sort of situation, you've really got to think, well, okay, I guess what I should do is commit to the passage which seems to me, on balance, more likely to be right than any of the other passages considered in isolation. Commit myself to that. And that is how he at least tries to make that last move from the judgment you make cognitively that it's more likely than not that, say, one particular religion rather than another is true. Doorbell's gone and my dog has made a noise. When you move from a cognitive decision to a lifestyle type decision. Right, I'm just going to shut the door whilst you think of your questions, and then I'll rejoin you.
Okay, have a think of some questions, guys. You have a discussion with the person next to you if you want some questions. So us all to engage with this. Yeah, that's good. Tim, should we jump into questions now?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay, hands up, guys. Kieran, over to you.
How persuasive is the ontological argument for the existence of God?
Thank you. So I can hear you perfectly, so I don't need for me to reflect back, but if people in the room didn't, how persuasive do I find the ontological argument for the existence of God? So I don't find the ontological argument for the existence of God very persuasive at all. Some people do. Some contemporary philosophers of religion are very excited by this argument. But I don't, and I don't have anything terribly original to say about it. I don't find it persuasive for reasons which Kant first articulated, a few hundred years ago, a couple of hundred years ago anyway. And there are versions of it since then which seem to avoid, to be fair, some of Kant's criticisms, but they don't avoid others, or at least the others can be reformulated in the spirit of Kant and apply equally well to them. So I personally don't find the ontological argument very convincing. The ontological argument, or at all convincing, to be frank, But the ontological argument is one of the exceptions to my general rule that philosophers nowadays are thinking about arguments not as proving definitively on their premises that the conclusion must be true, but of raising the probability of the conclusion on their premises. And that's the way they're thinking about arguments for and against the existence of God. And that type of probabilistic turn fits almost all arguments for and against the existence of God, but it doesn't fit all of them. And one of the arguments that doesn't fit for the existence of God is the ontological argument. So the ontological argument wouldn't fit into the sort of schema that I presented anyway. But for what it's worth, I personally am not a great fan. Are you a fan?
Yeah, I think it's good.
You think it is? Okay, so we've got a fan there. You're in good company. Brian Lefto, who took over from Richard Swinburne in the chair here. He thinks it's quite good. Yujin Nagasawa, who I was seeing yesterday evening, who's currently at Birmingham, going to be professor of philosophy of religion at Oklahoma University. He's written a book called Maximal God, where he advances a particular version of the ontological argument, which he thinks is convincing. Alvin Plantinga is the most famous contemporary philosopher who has advanced his own version of it. He's now in his 90s, but and is sort of retired now, but he's got a version of it that might be the one that you're thinking of and are persuaded by. And then, of course, there's some defenders even of Anselm's original version, which is now almost 1,000 years old. So it's got. I don't suppose anybody will be reading anything I've written in 1,000 years' time. So I couldn't look down my nose too much at Anselm's argument.
Chris.
Can I quickly just ask, are you a Christian?
Yes.
There's a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Is that so is that because there's a kind of 34% for you?
yeah, good question.
There is, what is it and why?
No, not really, I think. So so you've asked me a sort of biographical question and then a psychological question. And so here I've got to confess that my sort of psychological habits come adrift from what philosophically I'd urge was the right way to proceed. So the right way to proceed would be to assess all the arguments sort of impartially, and then to come to the conclusion that you come, let the evidence lead you one way or the other, and then make the decisions in the manner that I've suggested. If you ask, so is that what you did? I don't know. It's what I think I should have done, but I started believing what I started believing because my parents believed the things that they believed and told me about it, and I thought, well, that sounds all right to me. And since then, I've not really come across any reasons to deviate from that. So I've gone into this rather having already decided that, I didn't assign a number to it, but having already decided as a child, perhaps that, as a child, I probably said, it's 99% probable that God exists. It didn't really come up as an issue, no doubt. It's a little bit like, Santa Claus for some people would say it's a lot like Santa Claus, the belief, Santa Claus for a young child doesn't occur to you that he might not exist. And then at a certain stage, you might have doubts. So if anything for me, it's gone slightly sort of in reverse. I probably started sort of, if you'd asked me as a 6-year-old, does God exist? I said, sure, God, Santa, they're all granny, granddad, they're all, I don't understand percentages. What do you mean? Oh, okay, now I understand. Yeah, 100% of all of them. And then over time, for me, it's probably drifted downwards as I've thought about arguments for and against, but it's still stayed probably above the 50-50 mark, actually, for me, that God exists, despite that drifting down. So that's how I've got to where I am.
So for you, does faith kind of go beyond reason there? Or do you feel like you have enough reason to be able to support it?
I think probably more the second than the first. Yeah. But I might ask you, what do you think has happened in the case of someone you find in this thought experiment struggling up the passage that they've decided? Let's say they've decided it's 60% likely. They really. I'm pretty sure there's a gust of wind coming down here, but not 100% sure. So they've got 60, 20, 20 for the other passages. They commit themselves to the 60% likely one, and they go up. And you see them struggling up, and they're really making a lot of effort. And you say to them, "Well, you must be pretty sure this is the passage that's leading to the surface." And they say, "It's only 60% likely, but the others were only 20 each. So yeah, sure, I picked this one." And you say, "Oh, so would you say that your faith in this passage being the right passage goes beyond reason?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I think it's reasonable to have faith in this passage, given what reasons told me about it being the most likely passage to lead to the surface." What would you say? Would you say that person has had faith in the passage that goes beyond reason, or would you say reason has driven them to make the decision that they have? Yeah, I think you could say either of those things, couldn't you?
I think that example is based on there being an end goal of religion or an end goal.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, go.
But at least my understanding is that it's a bit more of a journey.
Yeah.
And I suppose fully committing yourself doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get there.
Yeah.
So that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that those are important disanalogies with the cave type scenario and the religious life, and and the rationale justification for religion. Are you pursuing a religion simply as a means to the end in the when? Are you pursuing going up this passage simply as a means to the end to get out? Or might there be things about the actual journey that make it more rationally appealing than some other journey, regardless of the end goal that it promises? I think those would be good things to explore for. Sorry, you were saying something.
That kind of passage, then you might get more convinced by it because you see the light or whatever.
Yes, that's true too. You probably would, wouldn't you? So that would be an interesting other sort of aspect of analogy you could explore. Yeah.
To what extent do you think that you can actually achieve kind of deductive absolute conclusions instead of always striving for the most probable conclusion?
I think in this area, not really at all. There are some sort of arguments but they're not to do with whether or not there's a God. They're to do with whether, if there's a God, would he do this or would he do that? So they're more to do with the concept of God and metaphysical necessities around that. Even then, I think you've only got probabilistic epistemic access to those things, but you can achieve more certainty there, I think. But with regards to the crucial issue, which I've sort of been focusing on, although there's no reason to focus on that, we can talk about other issues. Whether or not there is a God, I think in the end, it's going to be this side of the grave. It's all going to be probabilistic. If I'm right and there's an afterlife such as I predict, then on the other side of the grave, we can pick this conversation up, and you'll say, "What use is probability here?" And I'll say, well, not so much, because it's all clear and certain now. I was talking about what was happening ante-mortem as opposed to post-mortem. But so ante-mortem, with regards to your question, no, it's all probabilities.
Yeah.
So why do you think religion might be more probable than the other theories like science?
Thank you. So I don't see there being a need to choose between religion and science. If I say, Christianity tells me that there's an all-powerful God who created the universe. Science tells me that the universe began 13.5 billion years ago in the Big Bang. Great, those two things seem happily compatible. I believe science, I believe religion. You then think, okay, so what we need, science as such can't be incompatible with religion. It could only ever be some claim that a scientist was inclining to make, or that scientific consensus had converged upon, that would be incompatible with religion, even in principle. And you might also think, I wonder what sort of thing it is that would be properly scientific, that there could be a scientific consensus about, which could even in principle be contrary to a religion and hence force you to need to choose, oh gosh, I've either got to believe in the religion now, or I've got to believe in science. Now, some people have certainly thought that there was. So, even to this day, there are people who think that evolution, the theory of evolution by natural selection, that's absolutely incompatible with religion. So, if we've got good reasons to suppose that the theory of evolution is in broad terms true, well, then we're ipso facto getting good reasons to think that religions are false. But I don't see that as an incompatibility. It's only an incompatibility with some claims that people make for religious reasons. So some people might say, because I read in the Bible this, I think that God created basically all life within about 6 days. So therefore, we wouldn't expect to find any fossils that predated that, or any geological evidence that there was, and this all happened about, whenever it was in 6006 BC. We wouldn't expect to find anything else. And you might say, that would be the sort of belief which you have been led to by your religion that would come up against science. But in that case, I'd say, well, you've really misread what your religion sensibly interpreted was telling you to believe. So there's no real clash between your religious claims, as you should, if you were well advised, wish to make them, and science. So I don't see that if there's any in principle worry here. There may be in practice worries for particular people, but they just need to think through I think, and personally think through the science a bit more, maybe they've misunderstood what the science is telling them. But if they've got what the science is telling them right, I don't think there's any potential clash there.
Does John Hick's principle of eschatological verification act as appropriate evidence for furthering the probability of God?
So yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think you could, in the sense it was sort of implicit in what I answered previously. Oh yeah, you can't get beyond probabilities this side of the grave. Oh, I suppose. And I thought, now the other side of the grave, things will be very different. And I guess there would be a way in which this would eschatologically, in the eschaton, in the afterlife, as you wake up and look around and find out what's going on. You can imagine that you would be getting such a set of experiences that it became certain to you that you backed the right horse. You hadn't quite backed the right horse, but you got into heaven anyway, or whatever it might be. And if John Hick was there, as I have every expectation he will be, I'll say to him, "Oh, John Hick, we met once, when I was a bit younger," and I'll reintroduce myself, and I'll say, "Well, you must be, really, pleased that you're getting it all eschatologically verified in the end." And he would say, "Yeah, indeed I am." And I said, "Well, so am I." So we're all being eschatologically vindicated at the same time. And yeah, that's then pretty conclusive evidence. Yeah, it'll also presumably come with a certain sort of psychological transformation as well. So you won't be, even if David Hume's there, who, if you know anything about philosophy, you know that basically if it was a thought, David Hume could doubt that we really knew it. And that seems, of course, he's got lots of very good arguments on all sorts of topics. But you can't also help, if you read any of him, but think that, this is just a sort of, inclination of yours, isn't it, to be skeptical about everything, to think whenever anyone says anything to you, how do you really know that, and so on. And it probably, contributed to you being the brilliant, if greatly skeptical philosopher that you were. But without that character trait in heaven, when we meet Hume, he'll be a lot less skeptical than he was down on earth.
Yeah.
The idea of like the probability of God and that kind of swaying your decisions feels a bit like Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
And like you'd think, like especially with Christianity, at least how I understand it, that's kind of, it needs to be a bit more 100% than 60%, I think. So yeah, what do you think about that?
So I think it's a bit like Pascal's wager. You're right. But the sort of reasons I was thinking of were truth-directed reasons. So they're reasons for thinking that a certain proposition, God exists, is true. And you might have some reason to believe something's true, some reasons to believe it's false. And I'm suggesting that, on the end, you might find, well, I've got some reasons to think it's true, some reasons to think it's false. But maybe the good case from the theistic point of view would be that anyone who dispassionately examined all the evidence would come up with the conclusion that there's rather more reasons to think that it's true than to think that it's false. Maybe the probability edges up to 65%. That would be pretty confident. I think Richard Swinburne once said to me something like that would be the number he'd give to it. Don't quote me on it. I can't quite remember what number he said. And Pascal's wager is to do with what you should do if with regard to thinking that you might have reasons to believe things which aren't anything to do with reasons to think that the thing's true or to think that the thing's false, but to do with the payoffs that come were you to believe that it to be true and were you to believe that it's false. So someone might say, suppose you're, you do this thing with the marbles, you pull out 100 marbles and 76 of them are black and 24 of them are white, if that was in my example. You're probably going to believe, aren't you, on that basis that, well, then I'm pretty confident now that the proportion is 75% one way and 25% the other. And then if I said, I tell you what, I'll give you £1 million if you can make yourself believe that the proportion is 50-50. That wouldn't be giving you any more truth-directed reason to think that it was 50-50, but it would be giving you a rational incentive to wish that you can make yourself believe that it was 50-50, because that £1 million would be pretty handy and fleeting. It need only be fleeting false belief about what the evidence was pointing to, or what the likelihood of the marbles being whatever they were wouldn't be too inconvenient. So so Pascal's wager is doing the second type of thing. It's like sort of throwing the £1 million onto the scale and saying, what are you going to do now? As is indicated by that thought one of the problems with Pascal's wager is you can't switch beliefs on and off, like taps, as I mentioned earlier. But Pascal himself was savvy to that and said, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you should commit. As a Roman Catholic, he was thinking you should commit. So you should go to mass, you should do this, and then belief will follow. So the things you are under your direct control of the will are things like that, and those will you reasonably predict causally incline you to develop the belief that God exists, and so it's under the indirect control of the will. So it's a bit like Pascal's wager, but a bit different. And then with regard to, but doesn't Christianity require you to be 100% certain? Well, I was thinking that you might be able to make this distinction between what you're 100% certain of, which might be very little, and what you're 100% committed to, which might be something else. So I might, in political life, suppose you might not be particularly drawn to one party or another, but suppose I was to study the sort of climate science and read a few books and sort of articles by Greta Thunberg and go to a few sort of marches about climate, and I might then become really convinced that actually the biggest threat to humanity at the moment is global climate change. Governments aren't doing enough. And I become convinced that this is the right political cause. Now you might say, you say convinced. What do you mean? I said, well, I'm 70% certain that this is the biggest challenge facing humanity, and all political parties should be doing a lot more than they are doing. You see, 30% it might not be. Yeah, 30% it might not be. But if it is the most important thing, well, it's pretty important then that I kind of make some efforts to promote that political party. And so that's why you might see me sort of canvassing around the streets and going on Extinction Rebellion marches and, I don't know, chaining myself to some policeman or something to try to push the green agenda up the government's agenda. Not that it would perhaps work with the current people in power. They just say, this is a hate march, and you should be allowed out in the first place. But if you might think misguidedly then, but I might commit myself wholeheartedly to a course of political action. And you think, wow, he's a real enthusiast for that political cause. I can't deny him his 100% conviction in the sense of enthusiasm for the cause to which he's become convinced and committed himself. But if you actually ask me, and are you 100% certain that it's not an asteroid or something that's actually going to blow us up rather than anything to do with the climate, or it's not actually a nuclear war that's going to blow us up rather than anything to do with the climate? I might say, no, I'm not 100% certain of that. It's just I was 70% certain. And so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And as I say, in everyday life, in all other spheres of life, we don't get 100% certainty before we need to act. Moral issues are never like that. You're never 100% sure what you ought to do. But when you've decided what you probably ought to do, you are then going to try, if you're good intentioned, you might not bother, but if you're good intentioned, you're going to try wholeheartedly to do what you have decided you probably ought to do.
Is that not switching your beliefs on and off, though, if you have different probabilities? Like if you have loads of convincing arguments and you're on one side, and then suddenly there's this breakthrough argument.
So that you wouldn't switch beliefs on and off, but you'd reassess what you wanted to commit yourself to. Yeah. So in sort of but you would, and potentially. So you might say, no, I'm 100% committed to the Green Party cause, even though I only judge it to be 70% likely to be the most worthy cause to commit to, say. That might be your thought. And then someone says, well, have a look at this evidence, which shows that all of climate scientists have got together and it's a big conspiracy and so on. Now, it's a little bit of a problematic case because you might think you have reason to believe this is just some conspiracy theory nutter and so on. But if you did really, this is really good evidence that actually climate change isn't really an issue. How odd. Well, then you should reassess your 100% commitment to the cause that you thought was 70% likely to be the most important cause you commit to. And if another cause popped up the agenda, you should say, I'm going to transfer allegiance and I'm going to transfer my flag over there and then fight for that cause with 100% conviction, albeit judging that that's, only 60% likely to be right or whatever it is. So you're not going to swap readily, but you are reasonable to swap if you get convincing evidence that you've committed to the wrong cause. Yeah.
Tim, just one very quick question from me actually before we wrap up.
Yeah.
On a probability scale, many atheists would say God's existence is highly improbable due to the evidential suffering in the world. what just as because we haven't got too much longer, but just what are your thoughts on that? I know obviously you can't go into detail here, but saying, well, actually, it's highly probable that God doesn't exist because of the apparent evidential evil and suffering in the world.
Yeah, so I think that the problem of evil is the biggest reason to suppose that God doesn't exist. So I'd say okay, but that is, we need to look at evidence for and against before we decide. So two things maybe of this. Firstly, let's hear the version of the problem of evil. What are its premises? What principles is it relying on? Are the needless to say, as everyone in the room will know, this has been thought about for 2,500 years. So whatever version it is, there's probably some moves that have been made, and we could assess those as maybe undermining the evidential force of evil to an extent, maybe undermining it completely, depending on what version of the argument they presented. It might turn out that argument has nothing going for it. It might turn out that it has less going for it than they initially thought, but it's still got something going for it. So that's one type of response. What is the most plausible theodicy in the light of this particular, or defense, if you draw a distinction between theodicies and defense, in the light of this particular variant of the problem of evil? Let's go to it with that, and then see where the evidence lies after it's been engaged in with by the best theodicy or defense. And then there's the point I led with, which is okay, and whatever the evidential force, you've got to consider what the evidence is on the other side. Just as in a court case, if the prosecution went first, you might think, after having heard just the prosecution's case, you might think, "Whoa, that's a pretty open and shut case. That's really good evidence." There you go. I don't think the defense barrister is going to really be able to convince me otherwise. If I had to turn their verdict in now, he'd be guilty. He'd be going to the hangman. That's pretty damning. And then the defense barrister might come up and explain away 95% of that evidence. And in the end, you might think, wow, I'm glad I didn't vote when I just heard the prosecution's case, because the defense actually made a really good case. They undermined some of the prosecution's case, and they put considerations which didn't directly undermine, but which contradicted the essential claim that he was guilty. They put those considerations on the table. You know what? Now I think I'm going to find him innocent. So in this case, we'd have to say to this atheist, okay, whatever the evidential force of that is, you can't rest your atheism content on that unless you consider the arguments against your position. Otherwise, you're like the guy who turns in a guilty verdict after only having heard half the side of the argument.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm sensing you're sort of wrapping it up. Is that?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. That's good.
Aggie's going to just do a close now.
Okay.
And then we'll wrap up from there.
Dr. Mawson, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say I've thoroughly enjoyed it. We really appreciate your time with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.